Hello, everyone. This is part one of lesson two of Pre-Socratics through Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. Our topic today is a quite technical term, intelligibles, and we are going to work our way towards understanding this term. Last class, we started out to think about the pre-Socratic philosophers by studying Thales, who is presumably the very first Greek philosopher and whose claim is that everything is out of water, or at least that is his most prominent claim. So we were thinking about, what does that mean? Is he talking about constituents of the world? Is he talking about the origin of the world? And so on and so forth. And we were thinking through some options. One way or another, Thales is concerned with what we might call, quote unquote, the natural world. And as we proceed throughout the semester, we will reflect repeatedly on how difficult it is to even get a clear grasp of what we are talking about when we talk about the natural world. But one intuition that you might have is that on the one hand, it is a huge achievement to have a theory of the natural world, but somehow it is not going to work to say that all there is are natural entities. And why is that? Let's say that you have like a really compelling theory of the natural world, then what you have is the natural world and your theory. And your theory somehow doesn't seem to be a natural item. And that intuition that those are two kinds of things. There's on the one hand, nature, natural entities, the natural world, the cosmos, the universe. And then there is a theory thereof. And somehow the theory is a different kind of thing from the cosmos. That intuition drives early Greek philosophy and also Plato's and Aristotle's theorizing. And we want to sort of work our ways towards appreciating that distinction. Now, Parmenides, who is the next early Greek philosopher who we will study, is one of the most influential and really most intriguing, difficult, but also interesting philosophers, I guess, kind of throughout the Western tradition. Plato thinks he is divine. Parmenides moves away from what we were calling natural philosophy precisely because there seems to be this distinction between, on the one hand, natural entities, and on the other hand, theories, and now comes our term, intelligible things, or as we will put this, intelligibles, which is a kind of overtly technical term where we say intelligibles in order to translate the Greek ta noumena, which doesn't say anything like intelligible things or intelligible objects or anything like that. It just says intelligibles. And that is not a kind of ordinary English word, but we are still going to use it in order to kind of flag that in Greek, there is no talk of objects or things or facts or anything like that. There's just this expression, intelligibles, at least if we literally translate it. So how do we get, intuitively speaking, from the type of theory that aims to say, what is the beginning of the natural world? What are the constituents of the natural world? Toward a theory that asks, how can we make sense of this distinction between the natural world on the one hand and intelligibles on the other hand? One way you could get there is that you ask yourself, what is it that in general characterizes the natural world? And there are kind of two contenders for this in ancient philosophy, and both of them remain very much discussed until today. They are not uncontroversial, but they are still strong intuitions. The first is that you think, well, maybe the natural world is the perceptible domain. Nature is the kind of thing that, at least in principle, we can perceive. Maybe we can't perceive it, with the natural eye. Maybe we need a microscope. Maybe we need a telescope. Or maybe we need some even more complicated method to make it visible or at least measurable. But somehow it is either sense perceptible or at least somehow related to sense perception. That is one intuition. The other intuition is that nature is the kind of thing that is in change. So, you just kind of need to look at a tree and it, the leaves are moving in the wind and it's growing and it's decaying and all those things are going on. It changes throughout the seasons. And that kind of observation seems to apply to nature at large. So maybe you think, well, nature is the kind of thing that changes all the time. So here you have two ideas. One is what philosophers call an epistemological idea, that nature is perceptible. What does that mean? The field epistemology, literally speaking, that means theory of knowledge. The Greek term episteme means knowledge. But epistemology is not just the theory of knowledge, it is more broadly the theory of how we come to know the world. And perception is one of the ways in which we come to know the world, or in which we come to be somehow in cognitive contact with the world. So to say that nature is perceptible is to make a claim that is kind of, broadly speaking, in epistemology. And to say that nature is the kind of thing that is in change is to say something about what kind of thing nature is. And that comes to be called either an ontological or a metaphysical claim. Now, we will talk a lot about what these terms mean, and it's not an easy question. It's also not important that we have like a fixed definition, but we need to sort of understand the intuition. And the intuition is that if you make a claim about what something is, that can count as a metaphysical claim. So we have two intuitions. One is epistemological, that nature is perceptible, and the other is metaphysical, that nature is the kind of thing that is in change. And then if we ask ourselves, well, if we are going to draw this distinction between nature on the one hand and the intelligible on the other hand, what are kind of the analogs to perceptible and changeable? Well, the analog or the contrast term to perceptible is precisely intelligible. So the thought is there are perceptible things like trees and intelligible things like theories. And then what is the counter term to changeable or in change, in constant change? Well, the contrast term is that something is always the same. So the thought would be that we have now a kind of more complex way of thinking about this distinction. We have on the one hand the perceptible versus the intelligible, and then we have the changing versus that which is always the same. And if we add up these two distinctions, then we get to one big claim, maybe the most important claim that Parmenides is putting forward. And that is that kind of on the side of this distinction where you have sameness and intelligibility, that is the sort of thing that we are going to call being. We will say, what is the intelligible. And that is the sort of thing that is always the same. But the things that are perceptible or the perceptibles and changing entities, they kind of don't merit being called being. Well, why not? Because they are in change and because they are not intelligible. So that is a kind of big claim, also very revisionist claim, because of course in ordinary life, when we talk about a tree, we say the tree is beautiful. So we ascribe, at least in some sense, being to the tree. But according to Parmenides' claim that being is what is always the same and intelligible, it's not going to be true that a tree is anything beautiful or tall or in the garden or whatever. And that is a kind of really difficult intuition, and we will work our way towards that intuition in, throughout the next couple of lessons. For now, I want to give you the kind of little task that is the question on which we are taking a vote in this part of the lesson. And the question for you to think about is the following. So assume you just kind of, even if just hypothetically, you go along with what Parmenides is saying. You say, okay, I take it that only what is always the same and intelligible is or has being. And then I ask myself, what is going to be the counterterm to being? We had these like counterterms for always the same, that was changing. We had the counterterm or contrast term for intelligible, that was perceptible. And now we are looking for the contrast term to being or is, what is. So what's that going to be? That is a really, really tricky question. Philosophers in the Greek tradition think a lot about this question and they disagree about this question. So it's not a question where if you give an answer, you're going to give like the right or the wrong answer. Rather, it's kind of really something to think about where you need to think about why would you say what you say. So here are three options. The first option is that you say the contrast term to being is not being. The second option is that you say, well, that is too radical for me. If the sort of thing that is not is a tree, I'm not going to say that a tree is not. I will say that a tree becomes. And by saying that, I'm kind of using that intuition that a tree is a changing kind of thing. So that's a second option, that the contrast term to being is becoming. But then you might think, well, is that really what Parmenides is saying? Because, you're supposed to answer that question by reading the texts which are assigned for this class. And he seems to say either, for everything, either it is or it is not. And what is not really is not in any kind of way. So maybe the third option is kind of even more extreme than the first option. And it says just nothing. The counterterm to being is nothing. So those are your three options for you to think about. Either the contrast class to being is not being, or it's becoming, or it's nothing. See you next time.